The studio air was conditioned to a crisp 68 degrees, a standard setting for the NBC Broadcast Center at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Yet beads of perspiration were already visible on the forehead of the man sitting in the guest chair before the commercial break had even fully concluded. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, adjusted his spectacles with a motion that was too quick, too sharp for a man whose career was built on the bedrock of judicial deliberation. He smoothed the front of his navy suit jacket, a nervous tick that the cameras, now circling on their pedestals like predatory birds, caught in high definition. Across the desk, Jimmy Fallon sat with the stillness of a statue. The iconic blue curtain behind him seemed less like a backdrop and more like a closing shroud. The roots were silent. Questlove sat with his drumsticks resting on his snare, his sunglasses reflecting the studio lights, watching. There was no music. The applause sign was dark. The audience, usually a raucous engine of engineered joy, sat in a confused, murmuring hush. They sensed the frequency shift. This was not the Tonight Show they knew. Fallon leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished wood of the desk. His hands were clasped. He wasn't smiling. The affable, giggling host, who usually played beer pong with pop stars, had vanished, replaced by a man with the focused intensity of a grandmaster, staring at a checkmate in 3 moves. He looked down at a single sheet of paper on his desk, then up at Garland. The silence stretched, elastic and painful, for 6 seconds before Fallon spoke. His voice was low, modulated, lacking any of the frantic energy of a comedy monologue. "Mr. Attorney General, before the break, we were discussing the concept of institutional integrity. You used the phrase, absolute transparency. I want to stay there for a moment." Garland nodded, a tight, jerky motion. He cleared his throat. "Yes, Jimmy. It is the cornerstone of the department. Without transparency, the public trust erodes. That is why we have released more redacted summaries this year than in the previous decade combined." Fallon didn't blink. He reached under the desk and produced a blue folder. It wasn't a prop. It was old, the edges frayed, the cardstock faded to a dull, government-issue azure. He placed it gently on the desk, the sound of the paper hitting the wood amplified by the silence of the room. Garland's eyes dropped to the folder, and for a fleeting second, the color drained from his face, leaving him a pale shade of gray under the studio makeup. He recognized it. "That is interesting, Merrick, because I have something here that suggests the definition of transparency has been somewhat flexible. Do you recognize this file?" Garland forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a grimace, a rictus of panic, masquerading as confusion. "I deal with thousands of files. Jimmy, you'll have to be more specific. Is this a prop for a sketch? Are we doing a frantic filing bit?" Fallon didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He opened the folder. "This is the internal oversight log from the Eastern District Archive, dated November 4th of last year. It concerns the handling of the fictional docket number 77 Bravo, the so-called shadow docket." The air left the room. The audience, realizing this was not a bit, leaned forward. The tension was physical, a heavy blanket pressing down on the stage. Garland shifted in his seat, the leather creaking loudly. "Jimmy, I can't discuss ongoing investigations or specific internal logs. You know that. There are protocols." "Protocols," Fallon repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a judgment. He slid a single page out of the folder and turned it around to face the camera, then the guest. It was a photocopy of a sign-in sheet. There was one signature highlighted in yellow. "This is a visitor log from a secure facility in Northern Virginia. The date is 3 days before the public announcement of the recusal. The time is 2 a.m. That is your signature, Merrick." Garland stared at the paper. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked at the camera, then back at Fallon. He was calculating, his mind racing through legal defenses, non-disclosure agreements, and the devastating realization that this document was never supposed to exist. That could be a forgery. "I don't recall being in Virginia at that hour. I am often working late, but that specific location? No, that is incorrect." Fallon pulled another piece of paper. "We verified it with the Secret Service detail logs which are public record if you know which FOIA request to file. Your detail moved from D.C. to Virginia at 1:15 a.m. and returned at 4:30 a.m. But that's not the question, Merrick. The question is about who you met there. Garland's hands were shaking now. He clasped them together in his lap, trying to hide the tremor. He looked toward the wings of the stage, perhaps hoping for a publicist or a handler to intervene, to cut the feed, to pull the fire alarm. But the wings were dark. He was alone. I meet with many people, Jimmy. National security officials, intelligence directors. It is part of the job. This is highly irregular. I was told we were going to discuss the new outreach initiative. Fallon ignored the deflection. He picked up a photograph from the folder. It was grainy, taken from a high angle, likely a security camera. It showed two men standing in a hallway. One was Garland. The other was a man whose face was blurred, but whose stature and coat were distinctive. This photo was taken inside that facility. You were handing this man a physical hard drive, not a secure transfer protocol, not a cloud upload, a physical drive. Why, Merrick? Garland's voice cracked. He took a sip of water from the mug on the desk, his hand trembling so violently that water sloshed over the rim and stained the oak. This is absurd. You are taking images out of context. That could be anything. It could be personal effects. It could be unrelated to the department. Jimmy, this is dangerous territory. You are implying things that have serious consequences. Fallon leaned back, crossing his legs. He looked comfortable, almost bored, which made the interrogation even more terrifying. He was the cat. Garland was the mouse that had already been caught but hadn't realized its back was broken. Dangerous for who? Merrick? Fallon asked softly. Garland froze. The question hung in the air. Dangerous for the country, Garland whispered, falling back on the standard line. Fallon shook his head slowly. I don't think so. I have a transcript here. Fallon tapped the blue folder again. From the room where you met. It seems the audio recording system in that secure facility was not actually disabled as you requested. It was on a redundancy loop. Garland stopped breathing. His eyes went wide, the pupils dilating in the bright studio lights. The physiological response to total catastrophe. He knew what was on that loop. He knew exactly what had been said in the windowless room in Virginia at 2 a.m. You have a recording? Garland asked, his voice barely audible. Fallon didn't answer. He pressed a button on the underside of his desk. The studio lights dimmed further, turning the set into a cavern of shadows. A large monitor descended from the ceiling, usually used for playing clips of movies or funny cat videos. Now, it displayed a static waveform. Audio clip, November 4th, 02:15 hours, Fallon said to the control room. The sound that filled the studio was crackly, mixed with the hum of HVAC systems, but the voices were unmistakable. Voice 1. It's all here. The metadata, the deletions, the origin points. If this gets out, the committee hearings are irrelevant. Voice 2. And the backups? Voice 1. Destroyed. I watched the incinerator myself. This is the only copy. You need to make sure it disappears. I can't hold the line much longer. The audio cut out with a sharp click. The silence in Studio 6B was absolute. No one coughed. No one moved. The camera pushed in slowly on Merrick Garland's face. It was a portrait of ruin. The carefully constructed mask of the impartial jurist had shattered, revealing a man terrified of his own actions. Garland looked at the monitor, then at Fallon. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer a denial, a nuance, a legalistic interpretation of the word incinerator. But the words died in his throat. There was no spinning this. The context was absolute. Fallon watched him. He didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply waited. That? Garland stammered. That is a privileged conversation. You have no right to play that. That is a violation of federal privacy statutes. Fallon's expression hardened. It's a violation of the Federal Records Act to burn evidence. Merrick, it's a violation of your oath to obstruct justice. and it's a violation of the public trust to lie to the American people on this stage. Garland stood up. It was a clumsy, desperate motion. He knocked the water mug over, sending a stream of liquid across the desk, soaking the blue folder. He didn't care. He looked for the exit. "I am leaving. This interview is over." Fallon didn't move. "Sit down, Merrick." The command was soft, but it carried the weight of an anchor. Garland hesitated. He looked at the cameras. He realized that walking off now would be the clip that played on every news station for the next century. It would be an admission of guilt more powerful than any confession. He slowly, painfully, sat back down. He looked smaller now, defeated. Fallon dried the desk with a napkin, moving slowly, methodically. "We aren't done. We need to talk about the second drive." Garland's head snapped up. "There was no second drive," he said, too quickly. Fallon reached into the drawer of his desk. He pulled out a small, silver hard drive. He placed it on top of the wet blue folder. "The man you met in Virginia? He didn't destroy it, Merrick. He kept insurance, and he mailed it to us 3 hours ago." Garland stared at the silver rectangle. It reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. He looked at it as if it were a radioactive isotope. He was hyperventilating now. Short, shallow breaths that were audible on his lavalier microphone. The sound of a man drowning on dry land. "What do you want, Jimmy?" Garland whispered. Fallon looked him in the eye. "I want you to tell the audience what is on this drive. Right now. Live." Garland looked at the audience. He saw hundreds of faces, shadowed, judging, waiting. He looked at the camera lens, the unblinking eye of the world. He realized that the architecture of his life, the decades of service, the reputation for prudence, the judgeships, the cabinet position, it was all gone. It had been dismantled in 12 minutes by a talk show host in a suit. He licked his lips. They were dry, cracked. "If I speak about this," Garland began, his voice trembling. "If you don't," Fallon interrupted, "I will plug this into the broadcast server and we will play the files. We have verified them. We have the decryption key. It's your choice. You can control the narrative of your resignation, or you can let the drive do it for you." Garland slumped. His shoulders collapsed forward. He removed his glasses and placed them on the desk next to the drive. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, a gesture of profound exhaustion. "It began," Garland started, his voice a ghost of its former self. "It began with the request to monitor the opposition research files. We thought we were protecting the institution. We thought we were the good guys." Fallon didn't interrupt. He sat back, his face a mask of solemnity. "Go on," Fallon said. Garland looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. The data indicated that the breach didn't come from outside. It came from the 7th floor, from my office. The Protocol 7 designation. It wasn't a security clearance. It was a cleanup crew. I authorized it. A gasp went through the room. "And the incinerator?" Fallon asked. Garland nodded slowly. "Evidence of the authorization. We burned the logs. We wiped the servers. I truly thought it would end there. But in this town, nothing ever truly disappears." He looked at the silver drive. "Is that really it?" Garland asked, pointing to the device. Fallon nodded. "It is." Garland let out a long, shuddering breath. "Then I have nothing left to protect." The camera held on Garland's face. It was the face of a man who had walked off a cliff and was just now realizing that gravity was real. The studio was silent. The comedy was dead. The tragedy was live. Fallon looked at the camera. "We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to look at the files. Stick around." But nobody moved. The band didn't play. The applause sign didn't light up. The screen faded to black, leaving only the image of Merrick Garland, head in hands, alone in the spotlight, while Jimmy Fallon gathered the wet papers and placed them back in the drawer. The interview was over. The investigation had just begun.